The year was 1943, and the air in Camp Shelby, Mississippi hung heavy with the smell of pine trees and the damp heat of the Deep South. For Eleanor Vance, who everyone called Ellie, the air also carried a different kind of weight, the weight of being a woman in a man's world. A world where her mind, her talent, and her hard-earned skills were measured not by their worth, but by her gender. Ellie wasn't a large woman, but she carried herself with a quiet strength that made her seem taller. Her eyes, a sharp and clear blue, held a determination that had been forged in the fire of countless dismissive remarks and patronizing smiles. She was a member of the Women's Army Corps, a WAC, and she was a natural. While other WACs were assigned to typing pools and filing rooms, Ellie was different. She had a mind for machines, for the hidden languages of circuits and the clever puzzles of code. Before the war, she'd been a brilliant student of electrical engineering at a college back in Ohio, one of only a handful of girls in a class full of boys who barely glanced her way. Now her classroom was a dusty, humid workshop at Camp Shelby, and the boys were soldiers who didn't believe she belonged there. The workshop was her sanctuary, the one place she could lose herself in the hum of her work. On a workbench in a back corner, covered by an old canvas tarp, was her secret project. For the last 6 months, she'd been building something remarkable. It was a communication device, a blend of radio and cryptography that would make messages between units impossible for the enemy to crack. It wasn't a physical key or a code book. It was a way of weaving signals together, a complex dance of frequencies that shifted and changed in real time. She called it the Cipher Weave Protocol, but in her private thoughts, she knew it was more than that. It was her answer to the constant mockery, her way of proving that her mind was a weapon as important as any rifle. She believed in it with all her heart. It was a tool of victory, she knew it was, a way to save lives by protecting the words that guided men into battle. But nobody else believed in it. Her superior, Major Thompson, was a man carved from granite and stubborn tradition. He'd served in the First World War and saw the Army as a place for strong men and the women who supported them from behind a desk. He saw Ellie as a novelty, a smart girl playing with wires. He never called her by her name. It was always that girl, or the whack with the screwdrivers. When she had tried to show him her blueprint, he had glanced at it for a second and then put it down on his desk without a word. The message was clear. This was not a place for a woman's ideas, but Major Thompson's quiet dismissal was nothing compared to the open hostility of Sergeant Miller. Sergeant Miller was a barrel-chested man with a permanently sneering face and a loud, booming voice that seemed to be custom-made for an insult. He was in charge of the base's radio communications, and he saw Ellie as a personal threat. To him, her intelligence was an affront to his authority. He would find every chance he could to belittle her in front of the other soldiers. "Look at her," he'd say to his men, loud enough for Ellie to hear. "Trying to build some fancy little thing. A radio is a radio, boys. You plug it in, you turn the knob. Ain't no mystery to it." The men would laugh, uncomfortable but unwilling to defy the sergeant. Ellie would just tighten her lips and pretend not to hear, her fingers tightening around the wire she was soldering. She was a soldier. She was emotionally strong, but every cutting remark was a small, sharp wound. She knew she had to be better than them. She had to swallow her pride and prove them all wrong. One sweltering afternoon, a new shipment of radios arrived. These were the latest models, the very same ones being sent to the front lines. Major Thompson called a meeting to show them off, and he insisted that all the base's radio staff, including Ellie, be there. Sergeant Miller took center stage. He was in his element, holding up one of the radios and explaining its simple function. He spoke with a sort of swagger, as if the radio itself was a testament to his own genius. "The Germans, they try to listen in on our signals," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But we're a step ahead. We send our messages with a simple code, something a kid can learn. Plain and simple. Ain't that right, Vance?" He looked directly at Ellie, his sneer growing wider. He was calling her out, using her last name in a way that felt like an insult. He was baiting her. The entire room went silent. Ellie's heart hammered in her chest, but she met his gaze without flinching. "Sir," she said, her voice clear and calm, "that simple code you mentioned is exactly what the Germans have been cracking. The problem isn't with the radios. It's with the way we send our messages. The room held its breath. Sergeant Miller's face turned a deep, angry red. "A problem?" he said, stepping closer to her. He put his hands on his hips. "Listen, girl, you stick to your little projects. The way we send messages is the way we've always done it. It won't be a woman who tells me my job is a problem." The men around them shifted uncomfortably. Major Thompson cleared his throat, but he didn't stop Miller. Then, Miller did something that broke a small piece of Ellie's spirit. He took the new radio he was holding and slammed it on the table in front of her. "You think you can do better?" he said, his voice full of cruel humor. "Here, fix it. It's a radio. It's broken now. Maybe your fancy little girl brains can get it working again." The laughter that followed was like a physical punch. It echoed in the workshop, bouncing off the walls and the silent machinery. Her face burned with shame, not for herself, but for the injustice of it all. Major Thompson just watched, his face unmoving. Ellie said nothing. She didn't show a single tear. She simply walked forward, picked up the now useless radio, and returned to her corner. She pulled the canvas over her own invention, shielding it from their view. The humiliation had been public, and it had been total. They didn't see her as a person. They saw her as a joke. But they hadn't seen her real work, the one thing she knew could truly make a difference. And as she looked at the broken radio in her hands, she felt a quiet fire of resolve build inside her. The insults were not a defeat. They were a reason to work harder, to prove them all wrong. She would not let this moment be the end. It would be the beginning. The humiliation of that day became the fuel that kept Ellie going. It was a cold, hard lump in her stomach that she carried everywhere. During the day, she did her assigned tasks, which mostly involved fixing simple wiring and checking batteries. But her nights were a different story. The workshop, silent and still in the dark, became her laboratory. The only sound was the soft click of her tools, the quiet hum of her soldering iron, and the whisper of the Mississippi night. She worked on her cipher weave protocol with a new, fierce intensity. She fine-tuned the circuits, rewrote the code, and tested the connections again and again. She had to make sure it was perfect. The system was designed to take a simple message, like a series of numbers or a short sentence, and send it out on a multitude of ever-changing frequencies. It was like taking a single thread and weaving it into 1,000 different patterns at the same time, a pattern that only another machine with the same program could unravel. The enemy would only hear static or a garbled mess of noise with no way to find the message hidden inside. Her loneliness grew, but so did her determination. She ate her meals alone, her mind filled with equations and circuit diagrams. She would catch glimpses of the other whacks laughing together, and she felt a sharp, painful pang of being on the outside. But her purpose was greater than her loneliness. The faces of the soldiers who had laughed at her, the sneer on Sergeant Miller's face, the empty look of Major Thompson, all of it pushed her forward. Then a real problem struck the base, a problem that no one could laugh away. The day started like any other. The morning sun was already beating down, making the air thick and muggy. A large-scale training exercise was set to begin. The exercise was meant to simulate a real battle, a difficult push against enemy lines, and it relied on clear communication between the different units. Ellie was in the workshop, fixing a broken power switch when she heard the frantic shouts from the radio room. She recognized Sergeant Miller's voice, raised in an angry roar. She put down her tools and walked toward the sound. The radio room was a scene of controlled panic. Soldiers were shouting into microphones, their faces slick with sweat. The air was filled with a loud, frustrating static that buzzed like a hive of angry bees. "What's happening?" Ellie asked a young private who was frantically twisting a dial. The private looked at her, his eyes wide with worry. "We can't get through, Vance. The jamming is too strong. We're supposed to tell the infantry that the tanks are moving up on the north flank, but we can't get the message out." Sergeant Miller turned and saw Ellie standing there. "Get out of here, Vance!" he yelled. "This is a man's job. Don't just stand there gawking." Ellie didn't move. Her mind was already racing, analyzing the situation. It wasn't just simple jamming. It sounded different. The static wasn't a constant sound. It was a rhythmic, pulsing noise, a clever pattern that was designed to mimic the sounds of a specific radio wave, confusing the system completely. "The Germans," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "They're not just jamming. They're using a new frequency mimic program. It's meant to fool our radios into thinking the signal is just background noise. Your standard protocol can't cut through it." Sergeant Miller laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "You're talking nonsense. It's just jamming. Our men are trained to handle jamming." He was wrong, and they all knew it. For the next hour, they tried everything. They changed frequencies, used backup channels, and even tried to send the message by hand signal to a nearby outpost, but the message never got through. In the end, the training exercise was a complete disaster. The infantry unit was cut off, the tanks destroyed, and the simulated battle was lost. The air on the base felt heavy with defeat. Major Thompson stormed into the radio room and demanded an explanation. Sergeant Miller, red-faced and angry, had no answers. He tried to blame the new radios, the weather, anything he could think of, but the truth was clear. Their simple methods were no match for a new kind of enemy. That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. The thought of a real battle, of men's lives being lost because a message couldn't get through, was unbearable. She saw the faces of the worried privates, the frustration of Major Thompson, and the silent, helpless fury of Sergeant Miller. She was the only one who had the answer. She was the only one with the tool that could cut through that kind of jamming. The next morning, she knew what she had to do. Major Thompson was a wall she could not break through. Sergeant Miller would never listen. She needed to go over their heads. She needed to go to someone who could see past her gender and her rank. She needed to take a risk so big it could get her thrown out of the army. She knew her mission was to get her device into the hands of someone who would understand its importance. A general was scheduled to visit Camp Shelby the next day, a high-ranking officer and a personal friend of General Eisenhower. It was a long shot, a crazy gamble, but it was the only way. As she gathered her blueprints and a small, portable version of her device, she looked at the workshop around her. This place had been a sanctuary, then a prison. Now it was a launching pad. She felt no fear, only a powerful sense of purpose. She would not stand by and watch a war be lost because of simple minds and out-of-date thinking. Her redemption wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about saving lives. She walked out of the workshop into the hot Mississippi sun, her small bag of secrets held tight in her hands. She was no longer just a whack. She was a soldier on a mission, and she was ready to fight. The general's visit was a whirlwind of activity. The entire base was polished and perfect, from the freshly painted barracks to the neatly lined-up trucks. General MacArthur "Mac" Douglas, a tall and serious man with a kind face, was touring the base with a small group of officers, including Major Thompson, who looked more nervous than Ellie had ever seen him. Ellie had found a way to get to him. She had used her knowledge of the base's schedule and her quiet determination to get a chance to speak with one of the general's aides. The aide, a young captain who seemed less burdened by old-school thinking, had been intrigued by her quiet persistence and agreed to pass on her message. "She has a proposal for a new communication device, sir," the captain had said. "Says it could have solved the jamming problem in yesterday's exercise." General Douglas looked at Major Thompson, a question in his eyes. Major Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, with all due respect, this is a young whack. Her ideas are unproven." General Douglas just nodded slowly. "Major, in this war, every idea is worth hearing. I'll make time for her. This is important." And so it happened. Ellie found herself in a small, stuffy office, standing in front of General Douglas and Major Thompson. Major Thompson looked angry and ashamed all at once. Sergeant Miller, who had been ordered to attend, stood in the corner, a smirk on his face. Ellie put her portable device on the table, along with her blueprints. Her hands were shaking just a little, but her voice was steady. She explained her cipher-weave protocol in simple terms, leaving out the complex math and focusing on the core idea. A message that was not one, but many impossible to put back together without the key. General Douglas listened, his face giving nothing away. He looked at her blueprints, his brow furrowed in thought. He asked her a few sharp technical questions, and Ellie answered them with confidence and clarity. She didn't use fancy words. She just explained how it worked. Sergeant Miller finally spoke up, a sneer on his face. "Sir, it's just a radio. It's a toy." It can't do what she says. It's got too many moving parts. General Douglas held up a hand to silence him. A toy? He said, his voice quiet. He turned to Ellie. Are you certain, young lady, that this can cut through the kind of jamming we saw yesterday? I am, sir, Ellie said, her voice a little shaky now. With all my heart. Just then a private burst into the room, his face pale. Sir, General Douglas, a message from headquarters. We have an emergency. A real one. The general listened, his face turning grim. A key Allied unit was on the move in North Africa, a crucial part of a major operation. But the Germans had launched a new, powerful jamming attack, a sophisticated form of what had been used in the training exercise. The unit was completely cut off. They couldn't receive their orders, and their position was now in serious danger. Major Thompson looked at the general, his face full of panic. We can't get a message through, sir. Our radio operators are trying everything. General Douglas looked at Ellie, then back at the private. He thought for a long, quiet moment. He looked at the blueprints on the table, at the small black box. Then he looked at Ellie. He saw the steady courage in her eyes, the quiet strength that had faced down dismissal and mockery. Get this device set up immediately, he said, his voice a low command. Private, take her to the radio room. Sergeant Miller, you will assist her, and you will follow her orders. Now! The order was a shock to everyone. Sergeant Miller's face went white. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had to take orders from the woman he had just called a nuisance and a toy maker. The radio room was a blur of motion. Ellie worked with a speed she didn't know she had. She connected her device to the main radio system. Sergeant Miller stood there, silent, watching her every move. The other men watched too, their faces full of a new, dawning respect. She was no longer a joke. She was the only hope. Ellie adjusted the dials, her hands moving with a practiced grace. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. She was not just sending a message. She was fighting to prove herself. She spoke into the microphone, her voice a clear, calm sound in the static-filled room. She sent a short, coded message with a new set of orders for the unit in North Africa. Silence. The radio room was still. For a moment, nothing happened. The static buzzed on. Then a new sound came through the speakers. It was a clear, strong signal. A voice, the voice of the unit's commanding officer, a man far, far away, came through loud and clear. Message received. Reading back. The voice read back the message word for word. It was a perfect, crystal-clear signal. The room erupted in cheers. Major Thompson let out a long, slow breath he hadn't known he was holding. Sergeant Miller just stood there, his jaw hanging open, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. Ellie felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of relief, not of shame. The device had worked. The message had gone through. A crucial mission had been saved, not by a man, but by a woman, and a small black box that everyone had dismissed. Her struggle was finally over. She had proven them wrong. And as General Douglas looked at her, his eyes full of respect, she knew that everything was about to change. The days that followed were a complete blur. Ellie was no longer that girl. She was Lieutenant Vance, and her invention, now simply known as the Vance box, was the most important thing on the base. Orders came down from the highest ranks. The device was to be immediately mass-produced. Teams of engineers and technicians were sent to Camp Shelby to learn from Ellie herself. Major Thompson, now fully humbled, was the first to apologize. He stood in front of her, his face serious and honest. Lieutenant Vance, he said, using her rank for the first time. I was wrong. I was very, very wrong. You have a mind I could never have imagined, and your device, it has already saved countless lives. I am honored to serve alongside you. He shook her hand with a firmness that spoke of his genuine respect. Sergeant Miller was a different story. He had been demoted and reassigned to a different part of the base, but he still had to pass Ellie's workshop every day. His sneer was gone, replaced by a quiet, ashamed scowl. He never said a word to her, but his silent acknowledgement of her victory was more satisfying than any apology could have been. Ellie was a hero. She was treated with the respect she had always deserved. The other WACs looked at her with awe, and the soldiers who had once laughed at her now saluted her with genuine admiration. She was even given a commendation, a special honor from General Douglas himself. She was offered a new, comfortable position at a high-tech lab in Washington, D.C., a place where her brilliance would be celebrated and her work would be used to help with the war effort from the safety of the capital. It was a life of ease and honor, the kind of life she had always dreamed of, a fitting reward for all her hard work. But just as she was preparing to accept the offer, a new and urgent problem arose. The Germans had developed a new kind of jamming technology, one so powerful and so complex that it was making even the new Vance box less effective in certain areas. It was like they were a step ahead again, and it was causing huge problems for the Allies in France, where a major push was about to happen. The problem was that the new German jamming was so localized and so advanced that the Vance box had to be tuned and calibrated in the field. It wasn't something that could be done from a distance. Someone would have to go to the front lines, to the very heart of the conflict, and adjust the device. It was a mission so dangerous that no one would volunteer. The military brass tried to find a soldier, an engineer, anyone who knew the technology well enough to do it. But no one, not a single person, had the deep understanding that Ellie did. Ellie attended the meeting where this problem was discussed. She sat there in her clean uniform, listening to the officers talk about the risk, the impossible danger. They spoke of the mission as if it was a suicide run. They were so focused on the danger that they didn't see the simple solution sitting right in front of them. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had a choice. She could take the safe, comfortable path, the life she had earned, the praise and glory she had won. Or she could do what she knew was right. Her redemption wasn't about being famous or getting a nice job. It was about saving lives. It was about the soldiers she had seen laughing, the ones who were now in real danger because of the enemy's new technology. She thought of the men she'd seen in the radio room, their faces pale with worry. She thought of the men fighting in a war a world away. She had a tool that could turn the tide, and she was the only one who truly knew how to use it. She took a deep breath. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the nervous chatter in the room like a knife. "I'll do it," she said. Every eye in the room turned to her. Major Thompson stared, his face full of disbelief. The other officers looked at her as if she were insane. "Lieutenant Vance," one of the officers said, his voice full of concern, "that is not a mission for a woman. It is far too dangerous." "I am a soldier, sir," Ellie said, her voice rising with a quiet passion. "And this is a mission that requires the one person who knows this device better than anyone. That person is me. This is not about my gender. It is about what is needed to win this war." She looked at Major Thompson, who nodded slowly, a look of immense pride on his face. She had finally earned his respect. She looked at Sergeant Miller, who had entered the room to deliver a message and was now standing frozen, listening to her. His jaw dropped. Ellie's decision was made. She would go. She would take her device, her tool of victory, and she would prove one last time that her mind, her courage, and her sacrifice were as important as any man's. She didn't need the easy life. She needed to do what was right. The next day, she boarded a troop transport, leaving the humid air of Camp Shelby behind and heading into the heart of the war. Her journey had taken her from a small workshop to the ultimate battlefield, and she had never felt so ready. The journey across the Atlantic was long and filled with a kind of silent dread. Ellie was the only woman on the troop transport, but she was no longer a stranger. The soldiers knew her story. They had heard about the Vance box and the woman who had created it. They treated her with a new kind of respect, not just as a fellow soldier, but as a kind of legend. She kept to herself, her mind focused on the mission ahead. She was a woman of purpose, and her purpose was to win the war. When they landed in France, the sounds of battle were all around. The smell of smoke and dirt filled the air. Ellie was no longer in a quiet workshop. She was in a world of chaos and constant danger. She was assigned a small squad of soldiers to escort her, their job to get her to a key forward command post where she could do her work. Her small portable device, her tool of victory, was now a heavy and precious burden in her hands. The journey was a living nightmare. They moved through shattered villages and over muddy roads, dodging shell craters and staying low to the ground. Gunfire was a constant, terrifying sound. Ellie, who had only ever heard war on a radio, now saw it with her own eyes. But she didn't panic. She kept her focus, her mind as clear as her blue eyes. She was on a mission she knew she had to complete. Finally, after what seemed like a lifetime, they reached the command post, a deep bunker built into the side of a hill. It was a place of frantic energy, a nerve center of the battlefield. The commanding officer, a tired-looking colonel, was astonished to see her. "You're the one?" he asked, his eyes wide. "The one with the Vance box?" Ellie just nodded. She set up her device, connecting it to the command post's main radio. The German jamming was a powerful, almost deafening roar in the headphones. It was the same kind of jamming they had practiced against, but 100 times worse. It was a wall of noise, a shield against all communication. Ellie went to work. She adjusted the dials, her fingers moving with a familiar grace. She worked for hours, tuning the device, listening to the static, trying to find the gaps in the enemy's wall of noise. She felt the strain, the fear, and the sheer mental effort it took. But she kept going. She remembered the soldiers in the radio room, the look on Major Thompson's face, the shame of Sergeant Miller. She remembered her quiet struggle, her belief in her own worth. All of that was nothing compared to the lives at stake. Then she found it. A tiny window, a space in the noise that she could use. With a final, delicate adjustment, she sent a crucial, coded message. It was a simple message, but it held the key to a major part of the battle. It told a trapped unit that reinforcements were coming and that they needed to hold their position. The message was sent, and it was received loud and clear. The victory that followed was swift and total. The unit held its ground, the reinforcements arrived, and the Germans, surprised by the sudden clear communication, were pushed back. The battle was won, and with it, a huge step was taken toward winning the war. Ellie's device had done what no other could. It had turned the battlefield against the enemy. The next day, as the Allied troops moved forward, a German shell hit the command post. The bunker collapsed, and when the dust settled, Ellie was gone. She had completed her mission. She had sacrificed her life for her country, for her work, and for the simple justice of proving her worth. Her device, now known to be the key to victory, was used in every major battle that followed, and it helped win the war. Years later, a decorated general, a man with a tired face and a powerful voice, stood in front of a memorial dedicated to the brave women who had served their country. His name was Major General Thompson, and he was telling a story that had been a secret for decades. They called her that girl. They called her a nuisance, he said, his voice full of emotion. But she was a brilliant engineer. Her invention, which General Eisenhower himself called a tool of victory, was not just a machine. It was her spirit, her mind, and her courage. We all laughed at her, and we almost lost the war because of our prejudice. But she didn't want revenge. She wanted justice, and she went to the front lines and gave her life to prove it. She was Eleanor Vance, and her story is the most important one I have ever known. In the crowd, a young girl, no older than 16, listened with wide, tear-filled eyes. She was a history student, and she was Eleanor Vance's niece. Her grandmother, Ellie's older sister, had told her stories of a quiet, determined girl who had gone off to war. But no one had ever known the truth of what she had done. Now the truth was out. The powerful twist wasn't revenge. It was the simple, honest exposure of truth. The world would finally know her name. Her journey to justice had been fulfilled, not for herself, but for all the women who were still underestimated, and for the countless lives her sacrifice had saved.